Zhongyong, Grievance of One on a Campaign. Year after year, the Golden River, again the Jade Pass. Each morning, the horsewhip and the sword. Late spring, and snow returns to her green grave mound. The long yellow river flows on around Black Mountain. So we continue with poems and poets in this heptasyllabic quatrain section. Here we have the only poem in the anthology of Liu Zhongyong. So, as usual, when we introduce a poet for the first time, let's give some biographical background. So Liu Zhongyong, Zhongyong is his courtesy name. He was also his base name, Liu Dan. He was a native of Yuxiang in Puzhou, and he was an elder clansman of a more famous writer than him, Liu Zongyuan, one of the greatest prose writers of the Tang dynasty. But he came a little bit later in the mid-Tang. Liu Zhongyong he's a contemporary of the Dali era poets. So basically imagine his glory to be in the 760s, 770s of our era. In fact, he was a close friend of one of the Dali era poets, of Li Duan, whom we've encountered both as a poet and as an addressee of a poem in this anthology. In 774, Liu Zhongyong was living in Huzhou, where he and his friends, which included the famous calligrapher Zhang Zhengqing and the monk poet Zhao Ran, compiled a book of their own poems. Later on, he moved on to Hangzhou, where he died. So, as we said, this is the only poem of his in the anthology. The topic, as seen from the title, is frontier poetry, the hardships of the soldier's life in the frontiers. At the time when this poem was probably written, so in the 770s, 760s, 770s, China was experiencing some pressure from the Uyghurs and other Tibetan and Turkic groups in the north and northwest. And in fact, the geographical spaces that are mentioned in the poem are precisely those of that area, what today would be the northwest part of China, Inner Mongolia, and the outskirts of the Turkestan. You could interpret perhaps this poem, as most poems of the hardships of military life in the frontier, as a criticism of government policies that pushed and sent armies to defend the frontiers. But again, this is such a conventional, such a typical subgenre of Chinese poetry that it is difficult, without any other information, to try to delve on its intentions. And anyway, Liu Zhongyuan, as far as I'm aware, did not serve in the frontiers like other poets who wrote about this in the time did, like Sun Shen or Wang Changling. Anyway, going back to the poem, so we said the topic is life in the frontier. And the poem depicts, it's not too detailed, it's a quatrain, as you know. Quatrains basically can only paint one or two powerful images that are meant to summarize a whole story. The story here would probably be a military man, a soldier, maybe a captain, serving in the frontier for a long time. And, seeing the landmarks, the sights on the frontier that remind one of the distance from home and of the cutting away from Chinese cultural traditions and culture and the lifestyle. So let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet as usual. So the first couplet, as usual, gives us, you could say, the chronotope. It starts with references to two places, the Golden River and the Jade Pass. Well, let's read the couplet first. Year after year, the Golden River, again the Jade Pass. Each morning, the horsewhip and the sword. So the first couplet, emphasizes images of cyclical repetitiveness, but in a negative way, not like in the cycles of nature, which follow a certain natural order. Here they are the cycles of the days and the years, as experienced by a person uprooted from his land and from his territory in constant danger and without nature's infinite and perpetual ability to regenerate itself. Remember, man's life is not a series of cycles, it's a straight line that leads towards decline, old age, and death. So year after year, what happens year after year? Two images, which are geographical images of where the soldier is. The Golden River and the Jade Pass. So the Golden River is just a river in this remote frontier steppe-like land, corresponding, as I said, to present-day Hohhot in inner Mongolia. So pretty close to the frontier between China and Mongolia. So the territory of the steppes, the area that was not fit for agriculture and sedentary life in this period, and even today, I imagine. So Golden River and Jade Pass. The Jade Pass is in a slightly different area, more to the west, in Gansu, and it was, a mountainous corridor that psychologically and even geographically established the separation between the Chinese heartland, the lands of the Chinese, and the western territories, sometimes subdued by Chinese armies, sometimes not, but which were definitely alien and exotic. So you men, that is the Jade Mountain Pass, is generally a frequent reference in lots. We've encountered it already in this anthology. It's a metonym for crossing from the land of the Chinese to the land of the barbarians. So year after year, again and again, the poetic persona keeps wandering, keeps campaigning, keeps battling in those exotic territories. Jade Pass, Golden River. The second line moves us from this more ample time frame of years and physical landscape of landmarks to the more subjective and smaller time of the cycle of the days, even parts of the days, morning, and the objects are the objects of a soldier in the frontier, no longer the landmarks of the frontier itself, but what the soldier or captain is wearing. Each morning, the horsewhip and the sword. Those are the two tools that the soldier mostly uses. The horsewhip to move the horse through a hostile and harsh landscape, and the sword for battling. Actually, in the original, it's not a sword. I think others have translated it as a sword sheath, but I think in the original, it's a knife ring, so some sort of tool that latched to a short sword or a knife-like tool for hanging it probably from the clothes of the soldier. But anyway, the idea is pretty clear. Two objects used by a soldier who's battling at the frontier, and not as glamorous as the gold and the jade that lend their names to the Golden River and Jade Pass in the previous parallel, but in these images, partially antithetic couplet. So anyway, the first couplet depicts this life in the frontier with a focus on its repetition and on its exotic location in the north, and on the trade of the poetic persona as a soldier. Second couplet. Late spring and snow returns to her green grave mound. The long yellow river flows on around Black Mountain. So as opposed to other couplets, the second one doesn't really delve into subjectivity. It actually really continues the landscapey description studded with names of this foreign region in line number 4. And the hardship of the weather, and also, the second line continues with the landmarks. So the third line gives us a seasonal element. It's late spring, and snow returns to her green grave mound. So a couple of things here. First, this is a barbarian land with an exotic and harsh climate, which is denoted by the fact that even though it's late spring in the frontier in these regions, snow can still come in late spring, which would not happen in China at all. And the snow returns to the green grave mound. Now, this is a culturally very specific reference to the tomb of Wang Zhaojun. Wang Zhaojun was a legendary concubine of Han Emperor Yuan during the Western Han Dynasty, who was sent as a wife to the leader of the barbarians at that time, the Xiongnu. So she was sent to the ruler of the Xiongnu as a concubine, and this became a topic in later opera and poetry, like the quintessential image of the Chinese civilized woman forced to travel and to live in a barbarian land. And well, she was sent there. She married the leader of the Xiongnu, and She married, after he died, she married his brother, and she spent all her life in the territories, part of what was then called the Hitchin policy, of sending Chinese princesses or women as gestures of goodwill, and as establishing connections of friendship with these barbarians that by the late Western Han were really actually vassals of the Han. So she presumably died in this barbarian land, and the legend has it that her grave, her tumulus, was the only place where green grass grew in the steppe, with all the other grasses being, I don't know, grey or whitish or yellow. So it's late spring, snow returns to her green grave mound, just as the soldier fighting in the frontiers is a vestige, is an avant-garde, and partially lonely symbol of Chinese civilization in this area. So the grave mound of Wang, Zhao, Jung is also here in this foreign land, an avant-garde position, isolated in a barbarian realm of Chinese culture. And finally, the long yellow river flows on around Black Mountain. So Black Mountain, again, is a landmark like the Golden River mentioned in the first line. Here there's an interesting contrastive parallelism. The first line mentioned the Golden River, which is a clearly barbarian river. The last line mentions the long yellow river. Now, the yellow river passed basically through Chinese territory, but it made, in its early mid-course, it makes like this huge bend into the north, forming an inverted U, and in its northernmost reaches, it passes through the desertic Ordos region. So it was traditionally this area of the Yellow River, as opposed to all the other areas, whether the higher course close to the way or the middle and lower course. Those other places, those other parts of the river were very Sinicized, but part of the Yellow River flows through barbarian lands, and here it does. The long Yellow River flows on around Black Mountain being another of these landmarks in these Mongolian steppes. Again, the last image with this semi-Chinese river circling a barbarian land, I think hones in the theme of the previous line as well, and of the whole poem. That is, Chinese presence in a barbarian landscape, whether it be Zhao Jun's tumulus in a foreign land, the soldier in a campaign in this foreign land, or the Chinese Yellow River also crossing through this foreign barbarian land.